Hello, this is Jim Phillips. I'm asked all the time about the origin and history of PALS. PALS is an acronym for the Phillips Arctic Living System. Where did it and the PALS foam clothing all come from? How did it all get started? Let me share that story with you. I kind of break this down into several sections or eras. The first one is kind of the preparation era. That was from my birth in 1947 through 1956. A lot of family camping and outdoor activities, and we did some things in the winter, but we didn't really do much in the snow because it was just too painful. There was a discovery era from 1957 and 1968, then the refinement era from 1969 to 83, the scientific and commercialization era from 1984 to 1990, the industrial training era from 91 to 2001, and then the reestablishment era of 2005 and 6, and then in 2007 and on, it is the energy and expansion era. The discovery era began in 1957 when at age 10 I had my first real snow camp, and by the way, it wasn't a whole lot of fun. From 1957 till 1962, we did 2 or more snow camps each winter. We kept going higher and colder and longer, but we were totally dependent on fire, and pain and suffering was the norm. So you'd say, why did I go? Well, my father was my first best friend, and he was my hero. He wanted to go and be out there, and so I wanted to be with him, and we just did it as a family. I became a Boy Scout in 1958, and that same year my father was elected Scoutmaster, and so we started camping year-round both as a family, but then also with the Boy Scouts. By 1961, we had learned to wrap our beds in plastic sheets and bury them in the snow so we could sleep warmer. But everything that we did in the winter centered around fire, campfires, fire all the time, and fire pits. You had to haul wood, get wood, and you were still cold, wet, and miserable. Yet we were getting better at it and enjoying it a little bit more. In 1962, we took our first wilderness snowshoe trip. This was a 5-day trip into the Pecos Wilderness to visit lakes that had never been seen from the ground in winter. It was a challenging trip on snowshoes, high altitude, steep trails, but it was beautiful. The vistas that we saw was fabulous. However, we were still totally dependent on fire, and even during the day while we were hiking, sometimes we'd have to stop and build a fire so we could thaw out our poor frozen feet. We made it to the lake. We chopped holes in the ice to measure the thickness of the ice to report back to the Forest Service. We saw things that nobody had seen up there before. It was fabulous. Yet it was also a trip that had a significant amount of pain in it. And on the way out, as we were traveling back on the same trail that we had made coming in, at one point my father stopped and he was looking out across that beautiful area, and he said, we have got to find a better way to do this or stop going. We're just not masochists. And that was the genesis for the quest for what we now call PALS. When he got back home, he was still thinking about this and wondering what he could do. Being an engineer, he looked at the problem and he said, other people don't seem to have an answer. We're reading the books, we're talking to the survival people, we're listening to the mountain climbers, we're doing all the things as they say to do, and we're just as cold and wet and miserable as they are. So what can we do? That's when he hit upon the idea of using some of this open-cell polyurethane foam. It was not very common back then, but he had access to it in the industry in which he worked, and so I remember him sitting on the living room floor, and he was cutting out this odd-shaped piece of foam and trying to figure out how to tuck and fold and roll and stuff it, and he finally made it into kind of a booty that he shoved down inside of this muckluck that he had and went for a walk that night when it was 10 below zero. He stayed out longer than he had ever been able to and came back and said for the first time he's had warm feet at temperatures below zero. In January of 1963, we used those mucklucks on a 5-day snowshoe trip into another area and had warm feet for the first time on that trip. And then the thought was, well, if you can take care of your feet, how about your hands? How about your head? How about your whole body? What about sleeping? And so over time, it evolved into what we now have as an entire system. In 1964, we discovered another muckluck shell that had a vulcanized tread on it, so it was much more walkable. And about that time, we started camping at Wolf Creek Pass, Colorado. In 1964, Boy's Life published an article contributed to by my father called Make Warm Mucklucks for Winter Hiking. In the summer of 1964, we made the first foam sleeping bag and used it on a 10-day summer hike and had the best nights ever. In the winter of 1965, the moisture handling pad of open cell foam was added underneath the sleeping bag. Then in 1967, I decided I wanted to make the entire mucklucks. You see, the problem was these shells that we were using and shoving the foam down inside, it was just too tight on my feet. My father had smaller feet than I did, and my toes were always cramped. So I said, I'm going to get me a pair of overshoes and get me some cloth, and I'm going to figure out how to put this thing together. And so I built them in 1967. And at the same time, I thought, instead of just rolling up the foam the way we've done it, I'm going to glue it together and kind of make a pant and shirt out of it and try that and see how it worked. I used those on the trip that I took with Boy Scouts and explorers that I had. I was at the University of New Mexico, and I was a scout leader, and so I took them into the Pecos Wilderness to visit another lake that nobody had ever seen before. The trail was fantastic. The trees, the shadows, the snow, we loved those things. And now we had warm feet, and as a matter of fact, we were warm from head to foot. I stood on top of a mountain peak that I don't think has ever been visited in the winter, and it was in winds that was about 50 miles an hour, and the temperature was approximately 20 below zero, and we could have stayed out there all day if we needed to. It was a beautiful place to be. When you're warm, comfortable, and dry, the wilderness is not threatening. So we started to have a lot of fun because we were comfortable. For several years previous, my father and I had talked about taking the ultimate snow camp, which would be to go to Alaska in winter. And after looking at the map and the airline schedules and figured out that, by golly, you could just hop a plane and fly all the way to the Arctic, to the most northern tip of Alaska, Point Barrow. And so that's what we did. In the end of February, early March of 1968, we headed for the Arctic. We didn't have a lot of equipment to take, and we didn't need a lot of equipment, so we each had a pack for myself, for my dad, and for our dog, carrying everything that we needed for a trip that was going to last more than 2 weeks. The thing that's unique about this clothing is it has a very broad temperature range. When we left home, we were fully dressed for the Arctic, standing here in San Francisco in our Arctic clothing. And by the way, we did look a little strange. However, we were able to do that, and when we finally arrived at Point Barrow, Alaska, we just wandered off the plane. The temperature's 30 below zero, and after a little while, you put on your hat and your mittens. After getting our backpacks off the plane, we simply put them on and headed out to sea, walked off the end of the runway out onto that frozen ocean, where we would set up our camp. And over a couple of days, we built our main igloo out there. And the thing that's fascinating is we could see the curvature of the earth in that frozen sea. Now, you need to know that living like this can be very eloquent. You see, we had a sleeping shelf inside that was elevated above the cooking area, which is off to the right. And in the morning, instead of getting up to fix breakfast, you just kind of rolled over and you could have breakfast in bed. You see, this is wonderful living out there. Once the people at the Naval Arctic Research Laboratory understood that we weren't going to be a burden to them, we weren't going to be injured or be asking for help or to be rescued, we just literally had the run of the place. We also enjoyed visiting the people in the village of Barrow and got to do some very unique things and see things and experience things you just don't normally get to do because we could be up there and we could do it safely and comfortably. It was a fascinating environment up there to see and do things that I had never experienced before. The low sun, the constant cold. As a matter of fact, the highest temperature that we saw during that trip was 10 below zero. It ranged between 30 below to 10 below for the high, but we were safe and comfortable so we could thoroughly enjoy that. And as we're preparing to leave, the parting shot of me on top of the igloo with my dog Aztec. After traveling south for a day and a half, we found ourselves in Los Angeles with a connection that didn't work, and so we had to sleep outside on park benches underneath palm trees with Arctic clothing on. I guess you couldn't get away with that nowadays, but in 1968, we were just fine. But you see, the point is that we were able to leave home in the clothing, travel in warm conditions when we're inside, spend time outside constantly at below zero, and then travel back home in the same clothing. And we could do that comfortably. And when you use the clothing properly, it has an extraordinarily broad temperature range. From 1969 to 1983, I would call it the refinement and the play era. One of the things that was important for me to learn about was hypothermia from firsthand experience. I took a trip in 1971 snowshoeing across Jenny Lake and Jackson Hole in January, and I did not have the full PALS system with me. As a matter of fact, the only thing I had was the footwear, and the rest of it was conventional layer clothing. But you see, when it's cold and dry, you can get away with that. However, on this trip, the temperatures were hovering around freezing, and it snowed constantly, this very wet, mushy snow, and we became wet. And it's the closest I've ever come to losing my life in the wilderness, because I went into very, very significant hypothermia. Knowing the conditions and knowing the symptoms now, I would estimate that my core temperature was probably about 84 degrees, which is right on the edge of slipping into a coma. I was young, strong, and didn't know how much trouble I was in, and I had a friend with me that I'd got into this predicament, and I was focused on getting him out of there rather than focusing on me and how badly I felt. If I had been solo on that trip, I would not have made it, because I would have simply sat down and said, I need to rest. Well, I understand hypothermia, how severe it can be, and how badly it hurts. During this period of time, the clothing and the understanding of the clothing was evolving, and we were making improvements to it, but especially we were making improvements of how we used it and the rest of the doctrine that goes along with living out in the cold, about the nutrition, about water, and all those kinds of things. We had originally started by just inserting foam into other mittens, but that didn't work as well as making our own when we learned how to put the foam together and form them and cover them with fabric. Hats could be made also. The mucklucks we had been using all along, but my dad started to follow suit with the idea of making his own, and it was getting hard to find these shells that we were buying, so using overshoes and other boots and attaching a top to them. In most cases, the liner was simply a flat piece of foam that was folded. You folded it in half, then you folded it again, then you picked up the center part, stepped down inside of it, started folding it, wrapping it around your foot, wrapping it again and again, and then you would put that down inside of the shell that you had made and lace it up, buckle it up, and there you had the footwear. Not exactly like putting on a sock, but yet it worked extraordinarily well. The clothing was similarly put together. We call it roll and stuff. Here's all the foam pieces laid out flat. And for the pants, you simply take the foam and you just roll it up and shove it down inside the pants. The outer shell holds it together. Then you climb inside of them. And oh, by the way, one of the things that's important is you're not trying to put any layers or any kind of long johns or anything underneath, because that will destroy its performance. The shirt is done very similarly. For the sleeves, you just roll them up, shove them down inside. Then you wrap the torso part around you and then slip the shirt on over top, which is going to hold everything together. It's crude, but it works so very, very well. We had learned how to take parkas apart and add foam inside of them so that now you could add that on top if it really got tough out there. And with the hood on and the hat on, it was just about like being inside. We also made this face tunnel or snorkel hood that kept the wind off of you when you got outside in these low temperatures with very high winds. The sleeping system consisted of, from the bottom up, plastic sheet, which is your ground cloth, and bed wrap on top of that parachute cloth, which is the de-icing cloth, then the open cell urethane foam pad, which is the moisture handling pad, then the sleeping bag, which is actually made out of the urethane foam also. Then the plastic is wrapped around this and tucked in so you can put it down in the snow. Most of the time, because we're sleeping with our clothing on and with that sleeping bag, we don't have to bury those beds anymore unless it's extremely severe in terms of low temperatures and high winds. In 1981, my father was approached by Maxie Anderson because he had been trying to make this round-the-world balloon flight. They had made it across the Atlantic a few years before, but had nearly frozen to death on that trip. He knew that he could send a balloon around the world, but he was concerned if the people could stay warm. Reading articles about what we were doing and having other people talk to him, he came to my dad and said, "Could you keep me warm?" He took him camping at Wolf Creek Pass, Colorado, where the temperature was 30 below zero, and he stayed out there comfortably, and that's when Maxie said, "Now I know we can make it around the world with the Jules Verne's flight." Unfortunately, he was killed in a ballooning accident before they could make the final attempt, but in the shakedown cruises where he traveled at high altitudes and extremely cold temperatures, they were safe and comfortable. He was confident they could make it around the world because of the clothing. All along the way, there had been numerous newspaper articles. There were some other things written in books about us. There was also magazine articles, radio appearances. We had attracted enough attention that in 1983, the CBS network sent the PM magazine crew out to do filming of us in the field as we were training people how to live at 20, 30, and 40 below zero. In fact, on this very trip, one of the nights it was 42 below zero, and here you see people sleeping right outside with their beds wrapped in plastic sheets, sleeping on top of the snow.